I still remember the sound of my daughter-in-law laughing while tears rolled down my face. The room had gone silent. Thanksgiving dinner sat untouched on the table. My son, Ethan Griffin, wouldn't even look at me as he told me maybe it was time I stopped interfering in their lives. My chest felt like it was collapsing. After everything I had sacrificed for him, I could barely breathe. Then Vanessa leaned back in her chair and laughed, not out of nervousness, not out of surprise. She laughed because she enjoyed seeing me hurt. That was the moment something inside me died, and it was also the moment I decided to stop protecting her from the truth I had buried for 3 years. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touches your heart in any way, please like and subscribe so we can spend more time together. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been betrayed by someone you tried to help? What would you have done in my place also? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm reading every comment, and I'd truly love to hear your story. The woman everyone loved. My name is Wanda Griffin, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved people enough, they would eventually love you back. At 67 years old, I should have known better. I live in Columbus, Ohio, in the same brick house my late husband and I bought nearly 40 years ago. The maple tree in the front yard is taller than the roof now. Every scratch on the hardwood floors tells a story. Every room holds memories. Some of the happiest memories belong to my son, Ethan. He was my miracle baby. After years of infertility and heartbreak, I finally gave birth at 38. My husband, Robert, used to joke that Ethan was worth every gray hair we earned waiting for him. When Robert died from a sudden heart attack 12 years ago, Ethan became my entire world. I know some people hear that and immediately think, that's unhealthy. Maybe they're right. But when you've buried your husband, eaten dinner alone for years, and spent Christmas mornings staring at an empty chair, your only child becomes more than just family. He becomes your reason to keep moving forward. Ethan never complained about my love. He called every Sunday. He stopped by after work. He helped me shovel snow in the winter and fix broken appliances in the summer. We weren't just mother and son. We were a team. Then one spring afternoon, Ethan called and said something that made him sound happier than I had heard in years. Mom, I met someone. I still remember smiling before he even finished the sentence. A few weeks later, he brought her to my house for dinner. Vanessa Parker. The moment she stepped through my front door, I understood why Ethan was falling in love. She was beautiful without trying too hard to be. Her blonde hair was neatly styled. Her smile seemed warm and genuine. She carried a homemade pie and a bouquet of flowers. Not for Ethan, for me. I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Griffin, she said. Please call me Wanda. She smiled. Only if you call me Vanessa. We both laughed. At the time, it felt effortless, natural, comfortable. By the end of dinner, I was convinced Ethan had found someone special. She asked questions about my late husband. She listened when I answered. She complimented the family photos displayed around the house. When I mentioned a local charity event, she seemed genuinely interested. Everything about her felt perfect. Maybe that should have been my first warning. Nobody is perfect, But I didn't see it then. Neither did anyone else. Over the following months, Vanessa became part of our family. She remembered birthdays. She sent thoughtful text messages. She volunteered to help organize holiday dinners. Even my sister Linda, who distrusted almost everyone, admitted she seemed wonderful. Ethan got lucky, Linda told me one afternoon. I think so too, I replied, and I meant it. When Ethan proposed a year later, I cried tears of happiness. Real happiness. The wedding took place on a beautiful September afternoon outside Cincinnati. The weather was perfect. The photographs looked like something from a magazine. Vanessa looked radiant. Ethan looked completely in love. As I watched them exchange vows, I thanked God for bringing someone into my son's life who appeared to love him as much as I did. For a while, everything seemed exactly as wonderful as it looked. They bought a house. Vanessa continued working in real estate. Ethan's career as a construction engineer was thriving. Family gatherings were cheerful. Friends often told me how lucky I was to have such a wonderful daughter-in-law. And every time they did, I agreed. Because that's what I believed. At least in the beginning. The first strange moment was so small I almost forgot it. It happened during a family barbecue. One of Ethan's cousins was telling a story about a promotion at work. Everyone was listening, everyone except Vanessa. She kept interrupting, not rudely, not obviously, just enough to redirect attention toward herself. Within 5 minutes, the conversation had somehow become about her latest real estate deal. I remember noticing it, then immediately dismissing it. Lots of people enjoy talking about themselves. That didn't make her a bad person. A few weeks later, I noticed something similar, then another, and another. Every story eventually became her story. Every conversation somehow circled back to her achievements, her struggles, her experiences. Still, nobody seemed bothered. In fact, people often admired her confidence, including Ethan, especially Ethan. Whenever she spoke, he looked at her as if she were the smartest person in the room. I found that sweet. Until I began noticing something else. Whenever Ethan expressed an opinion, Vanessa subtly corrected him. Not harshly, not publicly. Just enough. A sentence here, a comment there, a small adjustment. Actually, Ethan, that's not exactly what happened. Or, honey, you're forgetting part of the story. The corrections were minor, but they happened constantly. At first, Ethan laughed them off. Then he started looking at her before answering questions, as if he needed confirmation, as if he wasn't entirely sure of himself anymore. One evening, after they had been married about 8 months, they came over for dinner. I served Ethan's favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes. He barely touched it. Vanessa, however, immediately began discussing a new nutrition plan she'd discovered. Within minutes, Ethan was explaining why he needed to cut back on certain foods. I blinked. This was the same man who had begged for second helpings his entire life. The change wasn't dramatic, but it felt strange. Like watching familiar furniture slowly move around your house while you were asleep. Everything looked mostly the same, yet somehow different. After they left that night, Linda lingered in my kitchen. She sipped coffee and stared out the window. Finally, She said something unexpected. "Do you trust her?" I frowned. "Vanessa." Linda nodded. I laughed. "Of course." She shrugged. "Maybe it's just me." "What is it?" "I don't know." I remember feeling annoyed. Linda had always been suspicious by nature, and yeah. "You're imagining things," I said. "Maybe." But she didn't sound convinced. Neither did I. Not entirely. Because if I was honest with myself, there had been moments when I felt uncomfortable too. Tiny moments. Moments that vanished before I could examine them. A glance. A smile. A comment. Something I couldn't quite explain. Still, I pushed those feelings aside. I wanted Ethan to be happy. More than that, I wanted to believe I'd gained a daughter. Someone to share holidays with. Someone who would love my son long after I was gone. So every time doubt appeared, I buried it. Every time a warning bell rang, I ignored it. What I didn't know was that those tiny warning signs were only the beginning. Because while everyone else was falling in love with Vanessa Parker Griffin, she was quietly becoming the center of my son's world. And little by little, without anyone noticing, she was making sure there was less and less room in that world for me. Slowly losing my son. If someone had asked me when I first started losing my son, I wouldn't have been able to answer. There wasn't a single dramatic moment. No huge argument, no obvious betrayal. It happened the way a shoreline disappears during a slow-moving tide, 1 inch at a time, so slowly that you don't realize what's happening until you're standing somewhere completely different. About a year after Ethan and Vanessa got married, I noticed a change in our Sunday phone calls. For most of Ethan's adult life, we talked every Sunday evening. It was our routine, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. We talked about work, sports, the weather, neighborhood gossip, and whatever else came to mind. Then the calls started becoming shorter. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get busy. Marriage changes schedules. Life happens. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Instead of calling every Sunday, Ethan would call every other Sunday, then every few weeks, then sometimes not at all. Whenever I mentioned it, he always had an explanation. "Work has been crazy. Mom." Or, "We've been dealing with house projects." Or, "Vanessa and I had plans." Every excuse sounded reasonable, which made it difficult to argue. Still, something felt different. One Sunday evening, after waiting all day for his call, I finally picked up my phone and called him. The call went straight to voicemail. I left a message. "Hey, sweetheart, just checking in. Love you. Call me when you get a chance." He didn't call back. The next day I sent a text. No response. 2 days later, he finally replied, "Sorry, busy week." That was it. 7 words, no heart emoji, no follow-up question, nothing. I stared at the message far longer than I should have, because it didn't sound like my son. The Ethan I knew would have apologized. He would have asked how I was doing. He would have called. But I told myself not to overreact. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe loneliness was making me imagine problems where none existed. A few weeks later, I invited Ethan and Vanessa to dinner. I spent the entire afternoon cooking. Pot roast, Fresh rolls, apple pie, their favorites, 2 hours before they were supposed to arrive. My phone rang. It was Vanessa. "Oh no," she said dramatically. "I'm so sorry, Wanda." My stomach sank. What happened? Ethan forgot we already made plans tonight. I looked at the table I'd spent hours preparing. "Oh, I'm really sorry." She sounded sorry. At least she knew how to sound sorry. "We'll do it another time." After hanging up, I stood alone in my dining room staring at 3 untouched place settings. That night, I ate leftovers by myself. Again. Then it happened a second time. A third. A fourth. Every canceled visit came with a perfectly reasonable explanation, which somehow made the disappointment worse. Because I couldn't point to anything specific and say, "This is wrong." Instead, I just felt myself slipping further away from my son. The real alarm bell came during a conversation with Ethan several months later. We were having coffee together, just the two of us. Something that had become surprisingly rare. I casually mentioned how much I missed seeing him. I expected sympathy, maybe even reassurance. Instead, he sighed. Actually sighed. Then he said something that stunned me. "Mom, sometimes I think you expect too much." I blinked. "What?" "You know, constant calls, constant visits." I stared at him. Constant, we barely spoke anymore. "I don't think I expect too much." He looked uncomfortable. "Vanessa thinks you're having a hard time accepting that I'm married." The words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Vanessa said that," Ethan shrugged. "Not exactly like that." But I knew. Because those words didn't sound like Ethan. They sounded like someone else's interpretation of me. Someone else's narrative. "I've always supported your marriage." I know. Yet he didn't sound convinced. It frightened me more than anything. For the first time, I realized that someone might be rewriting my relationship with my son while I wasn't in the room. The next few months only made things worse. Every interaction felt slightly off. When I shared an opinion, Ethan seemed defensive. When I offered help, he interpreted it as criticism. When I asked simple questions, he acted as though I was interrogating him. The strangest part was that none of these reactions matched who he used to be. It felt like someone had handed him a script, and he was repeating lines he hadn't written himself. One afternoon, Linda stopped by unexpectedly. I was trimming flowers in the backyard when she arrived. She watched me work for a while before speaking. "Have you heard from Ethan?" I shrugged. "Not much." She crossed her arms. "I ran into Vanessa last week." That immediately caught my attention. "Oh," Linda hesitated. "She said some things." My stomach tightened. "What things?" Linda looked uncomfortable. "She told people you've been struggling emotionally." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "She said you're having trouble letting Ethan live his own life." I stood frozen. The pruning shears suddenly felt heavy in my hand. "She said that," Linda nodded. "To several people." I couldn't understand it. Why would Vanessa say something like that? More importantly, Why would she want other people to believe it that night? I barely slept. Questions kept circling my mind. Had she been saying these things for a while? How many people had heard them? How much of Ethan's changing behavior was connected to what she was telling him? The answers came sooner than I expected. A month later, I accidentally overheard part of a phone conversation. I wasn't eavesdropping, at least not intentionally. I had called Ethan one evening, and he answered while apparently distracted. I could hear voices in the background. He thought he had muted the call. He hadn't. I heard Vanessa's voice. "Your mother always does this." A pause. Then, "She wants you to feel guilty." Another pause. Then, "She's trying to make you choose between us." My heart stopped. I wasn't supposed to hear that. And Vanessa didn't know I had. A few seconds later, Ethan returned to the call. His tone had changed. Become colder, more distant, more defensive, as though he had just been reminded who the problem was supposed to be. Me. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour. Not crying, not angry, just confused. Because nothing Vanessa was saying was true. I wasn't asking Ethan to choose. I wasn't manipulating him. I wasn't trying to control his marriage. I was simply trying to remain part of my son's life. But somehow, that simple desire was being transformed into something ugly, something selfish, something toxic. And the worst part, Ethan was beginning to believe it. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had spent years avoiding. Maybe Linda wasn't imagining things. Maybe those uncomfortable moments weren't accidents. Maybe Vanessa's perfect image wasn't as perfect as it appeared. But even then, I wasn't ready to face the truth. Because accepting the truth meant accepting something terrifying. It meant admitting that the woman I had welcomed into my family might be deliberately driving a wedge between me and my son. And if that was true, I had no idea how much damage had already been done. The money nobody knew about people often assume betrayal begins with lies. In my experience, it begins with trust. You can't betray someone who never trusted you in the first place. And for years, I trusted Vanessa completely. Even when I started seeing cracks in the image she presented to the world, I continued giving her the benefit of the doubt. Part of that was because I loved my son. The other part was because I honestly believed we were all working toward the same goal, protecting our family. I didn't realize until much later that Vanessa and I had very different definitions of what family meant. The first financial crisis happened about 2 years after Ethan and Vanessa got married. I remember receiving a call from Ethan late one evening. His voice sounded strained, tired, not like the confident man I'd raised. "Mom, are you busy?" Immediately, I knew something was wrong. "No, sweetheart, what's happened?" There was a long pause. Then he sighed. "We're having some problems." That single sentence made my heart sink. I imagined illness, a marriage problem, some terrible accident. Instead, Ethan explained that a construction project at his company had been delayed for months. Bonuses had disappeared. Overtime opportunities had dried up. At the same time, Vanessa's real estate sales had slowed dramatically. The economy was struggling. People weren't buying houses. Money was suddenly tight, very tight. As Ethan spoke, I could hear embarrassment in his voice. He hated asking for help. He always had, even as a child. He preferred solving problems himself. "What do you need?" I asked. "No, Mom, Ethan, we'll figure it out." How much silence. Then finally he gave me the number. I nearly dropped the phone. The amount was much larger than I expected. Not impossible, but significant. After hanging up, I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time. My retirement savings weren't unlimited. I wasn't wealthy, but I had planned carefully for years. Robert and I had always been responsible with money. We saved, invested, prepared. That preparation now gave me a choice. I could watch my son struggle, or I could help. The decision wasn't difficult. The next morning, I transferred the money. When Ethan called to thank me, he sounded emotional. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. I'll pay you back. I smiled. Maybe someday. The truth was, I didn't expect repayment. I wasn't making a loan. I was helping my child. Any mother watching her son drown would throw him a rope. Months later, another problem emerged. This time it was medical bills. Vanessa needed a procedure that insurance only partially covered. Again, Ethan sounded desperate. Again, I helped. Then came unexpected repairs on their house, then credit card debt, then another emergency. Over the next 2 years, I quietly gave them far more money than anyone realized. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Every time I helped, Ethan thanked me. Every time, he promised things would get better. And every time, I believed him. One afternoon, after sending another transfer, I received an unexpected call from Vanessa. "Wanda, I just wanted to thank you." I smiled. "Of course. We appreciate everything." Her voice sounded sincere, warm, almost affectionate. For a moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe our relationship was improving. Maybe all my worries had been exaggerated. Then she said something strange. "I haven't told Ethan how much you've actually helped." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I just didn't want him feeling embarrassed." Something about the statement bothered me. "I don't think he'd be embarrassed. He might?" I hesitated. "Okay." The conversation moved on, but the feeling stayed with me. A small, uncomfortable feeling, like a pebble trapped inside a shoe. Months later, I learned why. The discovery happened completely by accident. I had attended a neighborhood fundraiser where Ethan and Vanessa were also present. Several people were discussing the challenges of homeownership. One woman complimented Vanessa. "I heard you practically saved your family financially." Vanessa laughed modestly. "Oh, it was nothing." The woman continued. "Ethan told us you were the reason they kept the house." I froze. Vanessa smiled. "You do what you have to do." I stood there stunned, because that wasn't what had happened. At all. The money hadn't come from Vanessa. The money had come from me. Yet Vanessa wasn't correcting the story. She wasn't clarifying. She wasn't giving credit where credit belonged. She was accepting admiration that belonged to someone else, me, for the first time. Genuine anger flickered inside me, not because I needed recognition. I didn't. I had never helped for praise. But something about the dishonesty bothered me deeply. That evening, I called Ethan. I tried to keep my tone casual. During the conversation, I mentioned the fundraiser. Then I asked a simple question. Did you tell people Vanessa paid for everything? There was a pause. Well, the hesitation told me everything. Ethan, she covered a lot of things. No, she didn't. Another pause. Then confusion. Real confusion. As though he genuinely believed what he was saying. My stomach tightened. Because suddenly I understood. Vanessa hadn't simply accepted credit. She had taken it. Not publicly, privately, inside her marriage, inside the place where truth mattered most. Somehow, over time, Ethan had come to believe that many of the financial rescues had come from Vanessa. Not me. The realization hurt more than I expected. I wasn't angry about the money. I was angry about being erased. After everything I had sacrificed, I was becoming invisible inside my own son's life. That night, I opened a file cabinet in my home office. For years, I had kept records of everything. Old habit. I had worked in accounting for decades. I saved paperwork, bank statements, transfer confirmations, receipts, wire records. Every dollar I had ever sent was documented. At the time, I wasn't collecting evidence. I simply believed in staying organized. Still, as I flipped through the folders, I found myself placing certain documents into a separate file. Not because I planned to use them, not because I wanted a confrontation, but because something inside me whispered that one day I might need proof that reality had happened the way I remembered it. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Proof that the story being told about me wasn't true. The file remained hidden in my office drawer. Months passed. More distance appeared between Ethan and me. More misunderstandings. More subtle manipulations. And every time I started questioning myself, I looked at those documents. The numbers didn't lie. The dates didn't lie. The records didn't lie. Unlike people, what frightened me most wasn't the money itself. It was what the money revealed. For years, I had assumed Vanessa wanted to be loved. Now I began wondering if what she really wanted was admiration. Control, credit, the appearance of generosity without the sacrifice that generosity requires. Still, I said nothing. I kept protecting her. I kept protecting Ethan's marriage. I kept convincing myself that exposing the truth would only create more pain. What I didn't understand was that silence was already creating pain. And every month that passed, the cost of that silence grew higher. Not just financially, emotionally. Because while I was quietly paying their bills, Vanessa was quietly rewriting history. And my son was beginning to believe every word of it. The distance grew. There is a special kind of grief that comes from losing someone who is still alive. People understand death. They understand funerals, condolences, and mourning. What they don't understand is what happens when someone slowly disappears from your life while continuing to exist. No funeral, no goodbye, just an empty space that grows larger every year. And that was what was happening with Ethan. And the worst part was that everyone around us seemed to think the problem was me. By the beginning of the third year of Ethan and Vanessa's marriage, our relationship had changed so dramatically that I sometimes reread old text messages just to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. I would scroll back through years of conversations, Photos, jokes, birthday messages, holiday plans, evidence of a relationship that once felt effortless. Then I would look at our recent exchanges. Most were brief, practical, cold. It was like comparing two different people. One Saturday morning, I sent Ethan a simple message. Good luck on your presentation today. Love you. Hours passed, no response. The next day, he replied, thanks. Just one word. I stared at the screen. One word from the little boy who once called me 5 times a day from college. One word from the young man who used to tell me everything. The change hurt more than I cared to admit. A few weeks later, Christmas approached. Christmas had always been sacred in our family. Even after Robert died, Ethan and I maintained traditions. Christmas Eve dinner, Christmas morning breakfast, watching old family movies, remembering stories and keeping memories alive. That year, I assumed we would celebrate together. Then Vanessa called. We've decided to spend Christmas Day with some friends. I blinked. What about family? There was a brief pause. We just want to start creating our own traditions. The words sounded harmless, reasonable, even. But something about them felt deliberate, as if family and tradition were suddenly being positioned as obstacles instead of blessings. When I hung up, I sat alone beside my Christmas tree and cried. Not because plans had changed. Plans change. Life changes. People grow. I cried because I felt replaced. And somewhere deep inside, I suspected that wasn't an accident. A few days before Christmas, I met Linda for lunch. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. Talk to me, I sighed. I'm losing him. Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stirred her coffee. Then she looked directly at me. No. What? You're not losing him. It feels like it. Someone is pulling him away. The certainty in her voice made me uncomfortable. Because part of me agreed, but admitting that meant accepting something I still wasn't ready to face. Linda leaned forward. Has Ethan ever treated you like this before, Vanessa? No? Ever? No. Ever. She nodded slowly. Then stop blaming yourself. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But self-blame is easier than facing betrayal. If I was the problem, maybe I could fix it. If someone else was the problem, I had no control at all. Several weeks later, another incident pushed me closer to the truth. It happened during Ethan's birthday dinner. I invited him and Vanessa to a local restaurant. The evening started pleasantly enough. We talked about work, the weather, a recent football game. For nearly an hour, everything felt normal. Then a conversation about home renovations came up. I casually mentioned that Ethan had always loved woodworking. Before he could respond, Vanessa laughed. Oh, Ethan wasn't really good at that. I frowned. What Ethan had built half the furniture in their house. I had watched him do it. But before I could say anything, Vanessa continued. He tends to overestimate his skills. Everyone chuckled politely, including Ethan, but the smile on his face looked forced. A few minutes later, I brought up a story from Ethan's childhood. Again, Vanessa interrupted. Again, she corrected details that didn't need correcting. Again, the attention shifted. It wasn't one comment. It was dozens, tiny cuts, small enough that no single one seemed important. Together, however, they painted a picture in which Ethan needed Vanessa to explain him, correct him, interpret him, manage him. I noticed something else that evening. Every time Ethan spoke positively about himself, Vanessa subtly diminished it. Every accomplishment became luck. Every success became a team effort. Every strength became something ordinary. The pattern disturbed me. Not because it was obvious, because it was so subtle. The most dangerous manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. It looks like concern, humor, love. After dinner, Ethan walked me to my car. For a moment, we were alone. Just mother and son. Like old times, I almost told him everything I was feeling. Almost. Instead, I asked a simple question. Are you happy? He looked surprised. Of course, the answer came too quickly, too automatically. Really? His expression hardened. Why wouldn't I be? I don't know. The air between us suddenly felt tense. Then he said something that broke my heart. Mom, you always seem to be looking for problems. I froze. Because that wasn't true. Not even a little. Yet someone had convinced him it was. I could hear Vanessa's voice hidden inside those words. Not literally, but emotionally. The accusation felt borrowed, learned, planted. Before I could respond, Ethan hugged me goodbye. The conversation ended. But the wound remained. The worst moment came about a month later. I was attending a church fundraiser when Pastor Michael Reed approached me. Pastor Reed had known my family for nearly 20 years. He had baptized Ethan, officiated Ethan's wedding, conducted Robert's funeral. He knew us well, too well. Wanda, he said gently, can we talk immediately? I sensed something was wrong. We sat down in a quiet corner. Pastor Reed looked uncomfortable. I hope you don't mind me asking this. Asking what? He hesitated. Are you doing okay emotionally? I stared at him. What do you mean? His expression told me everything. Someone had been talking. Someone had been creating a narrative, and apparently that narrative was spreading. I've heard concerns, he said carefully. Concerns? He nodded. That you've been struggling with Ethan's marriage. My chest tightened. Not because of what he said, because I suddenly understood how far the story had traveled. This wasn't just between Ethan and Vanessa anymore. Other people were hearing it, believing it, repeating it. The image of me being painted behind my back was no longer a private family issue. It had become my reputation. An elderly mother who couldn't let go. A jealous mother-in-law. A controlling parent. I drove home in tears that night. For the first time, anger mixed with sadness. Not explosive anger, quiet anger, dangerous anger, the kind that grows when someone repeatedly twists the truth. Still, I didn't confront Vanessa. Still, I protected her. Still, I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Because accepting the truth meant accepting something terrifying. It meant admitting that the woman I had welcomed into my family wasn't merely insecure. She wasn't merely selfish. She was actively working to reshape how people saw me, and somehow, she was succeeding. What I didn't know then was that the biggest secret of all had already landed in my hands, a secret involving Vanessa's own mother. A secret I had been hiding for nearly 3 years. A secret that could destroy everything. And very soon, I would have to decide whether keeping that secret was worth losing my son forever. The secret I kept. There are moments in life when doing the right thing and doing the easy thing look exactly the same. At least in the beginning, you convince yourself you're being compassionate, patient, understanding. But years later, you realize you weren't protecting someone else. You were protecting yourself from a difficult decision. That realization haunted me every day after I met Margaret Parker. And now, looking back, I can finally admit something that isn't easy to say. I should have told the truth much sooner. The secret that would eventually destroy Vanessa's carefully constructed image entered my life almost 3 years before Thanksgiving. At the time, Ethan and Vanessa had been married for about 4 years. Things between Ethan and me were already becoming strained. Not terrible, not yet. But the distance was growing. The misunderstandings were multiplying. The relationship I once had with my son felt increasingly fragile. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, I received a phone call from a woman I'd never met. Wanda Griffin? The voice sounded weak. Tired. Yes. My name is Margaret Parker, and I remember the name immediately. Parker, Vanessa's maiden name. My grip tightened around the phone. I'm sorry to bother you. Something in her voice made me sit down. No bother at all. There was a long silence. Then she asked a question that changed everything. Do you know who I am? I frowned. You're Vanessa's mother? A soft, painful laugh escaped her lips. At least someone still remembers that. The words chilled me. Over the next hour, Margaret told me a story I struggled to believe in. Not because she sounded dishonest. Because the story sounded impossible. According to Margaret, she and Vanessa had not spoken regularly in years, not months, years. At first, I assumed there had been a family disagreement. Every family has conflict. Every parent and child argue. But this was something else entirely. Margaret explained that after her husband died, she had experienced serious health problems, medical complications, mobility issues, financial difficulties. She needed help, support, family. Instead, she said Vanessa gradually disappeared. Calls stopped. Visits stopped. Holiday invitations stopped. Eventually, even basic communication became rare. The image Margaret painted was so different from the loving, compassionate woman I knew that I found myself questioning every detail. Surely there had to be another side. Another explanation. Another perspective. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach drop. I think my daughter has taken control of money that doesn't belong to her. I froze. What? Margaret's voice trembled. She explained that after several medical procedures, she had trusted Vanessa to help manage certain financial documents. Insurance paperwork, property documents, bank records, things that had become difficult for her to handle alone. According to Margaret, assets slowly began disappearing. Accounts changed. Documents moved. Decisions made without her understanding. By the time she realized what was happening, much of the damage had already been done. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at the wall. The entire story sounded unbelievable, and yet something about it fit. Not completely, not enough to prove anything, but enough to make me uncomfortable. After our conversation ended, I spent days trying to convince myself Margaret had misunderstood the situation. Perhaps she was confused. Perhaps age had affected her memory. Perhaps grief had distorted her perception. I desperately wanted those explanations to be true, because the alternative was terrifying. A few weeks later, Margaret called again. Then again. Eventually, we began speaking regularly. The more I listened, the more difficult it became to dismiss her concerns. She never exaggerated, never dramatized, never seemed interested in revenge. If anything, she sounded heartbroken, not angry, heartbroken. One afternoon she said something I'll never forget. "Wanda, I don't care about the money anymore." I sat quietly. "I just want my daughter back." The sadness in her voice nearly broke me. I thought about Ethan. I thought about how much I loved him, and suddenly I couldn't imagine choosing money over my child. Yet, according to Margaret, that was exactly what had happened. Several months later, I decided to verify some of the information myself. Not because I distrusted Margaret, because I needed facts. I had spent 30 years working with financial records. I believed in evidence, not assumptions, not emotions, evidence, through public records and documents Margaret legally possessed. A troubling pattern emerged. Property transfers, financial changes, signatures, transactions. Nothing individually proved criminal behavior. But together, they painted a deeply disturbing picture. The more I learned, the more frightened I became, not for myself, for Ethan. Because if Margaret was telling the truth, Vanessa wasn't simply selfish. She wasn't simply manipulative. She was capable of using trust as a weapon. And Ethan trusted her completely. Then came the confrontation. I didn't plan it. It happened naturally during a family gathering. Vanessa and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I decided to take a risk. "I spoke with your mother." The reaction was immediate. Vanessa's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for me to notice, enough for me to know. "What about her?" The coldness in her voice shocked me. I chose my words carefully. "She's struggling." Vanessa shrugged. "She always struggles." The lack of concern startled me. I waited. Eventually, I mentioned some of Margaret's concerns, very gently, very carefully. I wasn't accusing. I was asking. Within seconds, Vanessa's entire demeanor transformed. Tears appeared. Her voice cracked. Her voice. She described years of sacrifice, years of hardship, years of emotional abuse from her mother. The story sounded convincing. Incredibly convincing. If I hadn't spoken directly with Margaret, I might have believed every word. Then Vanessa grabbed my hand. Her eyes filled with tears. "Wanda, please." I looked at her. "Please what?" She lowered her voice. "Don't tell Ethan." The request stunned me. She wasn't asking me to believe her. She wasn't asking me to investigate further. She was asking me to remain silent. I don't want him dragged into family drama. I remember staring at her for a very long time. And then she said the sentence that ultimately changed everything. I love your son. For a moment, I believed her. Maybe she did love Ethan. Maybe she loved him in her own complicated, damaged way. Maybe everyone deserved a second chance. Maybe exposing the truth would destroy my son's marriage. Maybe it would destroy his happiness. Maybe it would destroy his future. And so I made the biggest mistake of my life. I chose silence. I told myself I was protecting Ethan. I told myself I was preserving peace. I told myself Vanessa would change. I told myself families deserved grace. But deep down, another truth existed. I was afraid of being responsible for blowing apart my son's life. Afraid of what Ethan might think if I exposed his wife. Afraid of losing him. So I buried the evidence. I filed away the documents, saved the emails, stored the letters, and promised myself I would never need them. For 3 years, I kept that promise. Even as Vanessa pushed me further from Ethan. Even as lies spread. Even as my reputation suffered. I protected her secret. Because I believed protecting the marriage meant protecting my son. What I didn't understand was that some secrets don't protect families. They poison them. And by the time I finally realized that the damage was already far greater than I imagined. Because Thanksgiving was approaching. And so was the moment when everything would begin to unravel. Thanksgiving night. Some family dinners end with laughter. Some end with hugs. Some end with promises to see each other again soon. The Thanksgiving dinner that changed my life ended with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room after something breaks. Not a plate, not a glass. A relationship. By the time Thanksgiving arrived that year, I was emotionally exhausted. For months, I had been carrying 2 separate burdens. The first was losing Ethan little by little. The second was the secret I carried about Vanessa. Every day I told myself to remain patient. Every day I convinced myself things would improve. Every day I found a new reason not to tell the truth. I had become so accustomed to protecting everyone else that I no longer noticed how much it was costing me. Thanksgiving dinner was being hosted at Ethan and Vanessa's house. The invitation itself had surprised me. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps things were improving. Maybe the holiday would bring us together. Maybe old wounds could heal. Maybe I had worried for nothing. Looking back now, I realize hope can be a dangerous thing. Especially when you're hoping for something someone else has no intention of giving. I arrived carrying a homemade pecan pie. The same recipe my husband Robert had loved for decades. The same pie Ethan used to request every Thanksgiving. When Vanessa opened the door, she greeted me with a smile. It looked perfect, just like always. Happy Thanksgiving, Wanda. Happy Thanksgiving. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Family members chatted in the living room. Children played near the fireplace. Football games filled the background with familiar noise. The smell of roasted turkey drifted through the house. Anyone looking from the outside would have seen a happy family gathering. No one would have guessed how much tension existed beneath the surface. As the afternoon passed, I noticed something familiar. Vanessa controlled every conversation, not aggressively, not obviously, but effectively. Whenever someone discussed their own experiences, Vanessa somehow redirected attention back to herself. A story about a new job became a discussion about her career. A story about travel became a discussion about her vacations. A conversation about family traditions somehow became another opportunity for her to explain why her way was best. Most people didn't notice, or perhaps they didn't want to. But once you see a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. The first uncomfortable moment happened before dinner. A group of relatives had gathered in the kitchen. Someone asked me about retirement. I answered honestly. Then I mentioned how much I missed Robert during the holidays. The room became quiet for a moment. It wasn't dramatic, just a brief acknowledgement of loss. Before anyone else could respond, Vanessa laughed lightly. Oh, Wanda gets sentimental every Thanksgiving. Several people chuckled politely. I forced a smile. But something about the comment stung. Not because it was entirely false. I did get emotional sometimes. But because of the way she said it. As if my grief were a personality quirk. As if losing my husband of 38 years were somehow amusing. I let it go. Like always. Dinner began shortly afterward. For the first 20 minutes, things remained peaceful. People complimented the food. Stories were exchanged. Wine glasses clinked. Then the conversation shifted toward family relationships. One of Ethan's cousins mentioned how important it was to maintain healthy boundaries with parents. Immediately, I saw Vanessa's eyes light up. The topic was practically an invitation. Oh, absolutely, she said. Everyone looked toward her. She smiled. Sometimes parents have a hard time accepting that their children grow up. A few heads nodded. My stomach tightened. I already knew where this was going, Vanessa continued. Some people mean well, another smile, but they struggle letting go. The room grew quieter. I felt heat rise into my face, not because she had mentioned me directly, because she didn't need to. Everyone understood exactly who she meant. Then she added something that made my chest ache. Ethan and I have worked really hard to create healthy boundaries. I glanced at my son. He didn't say anything, didn't object, didn't defend me. He simply stared at his plate. That hurt more than Vanessa's words. I could survive criticism. What I couldn't survive was watching my son silently agree with it. The conversation moved on, but the damage remained. For the next hour, subtle comments continued. Each one small, each one harmless if viewed alone. Together, they formed a pattern. A narrative, a story about an overbearing mother who couldn't let go. A story about a woman who made herself the victim. A story about me. By dessert, I felt emotionally drained. Then came the moment I still remember in painful detail. One of Vanessa's friends asked how Ethan and I had managed after Robert died. The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. It was difficult. I smiled softly. But Ethan helped me survive some very dark years. For a moment, genuine emotion entered my voice. I wasn't performing. I wasn't seeking attention. I was simply remembering. Then Vanessa spoke. Oh. Ethan's always felt responsible for everyone. The comment sounded innocent. Until she continued. Especially his mother. A few people laughed. My smile faded. She wasn't finished. He spent years feeling guilty whenever he tried to live his own life. The room suddenly felt much smaller. My hands tightened beneath the table. Because that wasn't true. Not even close. I had spent my entire adult life encouraging Ethan to chase opportunities, to build a career, to find love, to live fully. Yet here I sat, listening to someone rewrite decades of history. And worst of all, people believed her. Why wouldn't they? She sounded calm, reasonable, confident. I sounded emotional, older, tired. A familiar realization settled over me. Facts matter, but presentation often matters more. Vanessa understood that better than anyone. A few minutes later, Linda leaned toward me. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I'm fine." It was a lie. She knew it. I knew it. I knew. Still, neither of us pushed further, because making a scene would only help Vanessa's narrative. Eventually, dinner ended. Guests moved into smaller groups around the house. I found myself standing near the back patio, trying to breathe, trying to compose myself, trying not to cry. Then Ethan approached. For a brief moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe he had noticed. Maybe he wanted to check on me. Instead, he sighed. "Mom." Something in his voice immediately alarmed me. "What is it?" He looked uncomfortable. Then he said words I will never forget. "Why can't you just let things be?" I stared at him. "What?" Every holiday feels stressful. My heart sank. Stressful I had barely spoken all evening. He continued. "Vanessa feels like you're always judging her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything that had happened, I was somehow still the problem, not the insults, not the humiliation, not the constant manipulation. Me. For a moment, I nearly told him everything. Everything about Margaret, everything about the documents, everything about the lies. The words rose into my throat, then stopped, because I looked at my son and saw a man who wasn't ready to hear the truth. Not yet, so I swallowed it. Again, I protected Vanessa. Again, and that decision would haunt me. Because Thanksgiving wasn't the breaking point. Not quite. The breaking point was still coming. A few weeks later, a single laugh. One cruel moment. One expression on Vanessa's face. A moment so cold, so revealing that it would finally destroy every excuse I had made for her. And once that happened, I would never protect her again. The laugh that changed everything. People often imagine life-changing moments as dramatic events. A car accident, a diagnosis, a shocking confession. But sometimes the moment that changes your life is much smaller. A single sentence, a look, a smile, or in my case, a laugh. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Ethan called me unexpectedly. At first, I was happy to see his name appear on my phone. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe he wanted to reconnect. Maybe he missed me. Maybe the distance between us was finally shrinking. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." His tone was polite, but distant. "Hey, Mom." Something felt wrong. I could hear it instantly. There was a stiffness in his voice that hadn't existed before Vanessa entered our lives. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, mostly small talk, nothing meaningful, nothing personal. Then he mentioned that he and Vanessa were hosting a Christmas gathering at their house. A small party, friends, neighbors, a few relatives. When he invited me, I accepted immediately, not because I wanted to attend, because I wanted another chance to connect with my son. Another chance to repair what had been broken. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that some things were already too damaged to repair politely. The gathering took place on a cold December evening. Snow covered the neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed from rooftops and front porches. From the outside, Ethan's home looked beautiful, warm, welcoming, happy. The illusion was almost perfect. Inside, the house was crowded. Music played softly. People laughed. Children ran through the hallways. I spent most of the evening trying to stay invisible. After Thanksgiving, I had learned my lesson. Speak less, share less, exist quietly. Perhaps then I wouldn't become another target. For a while, it worked. I chatted with a few relatives, helped in the kitchen, complimented the decorations, avoided conflict, avoided Vanessa. But conflict has a way of finding people who spend too long avoiding it. Near the end of the evening, I found Ethan alone in the dining room. For the first time all night, we had a moment together. Just the two of us. I smiled. Beautiful party. Thanks. A pause. Then another. The silence between us felt unnatural, like strangers trying to make conversation. Finally, I decided to be honest, not confrontational, just honest. I miss you. Ethan looked away. The reaction alone told me everything. Because a son who misses his mother back doesn't avoid eye contact. A son who misses his mother doesn't look uncomfortable hearing those words. I've been busy. I know. Another silence. Then I said something that had been sitting in my heart for years. I feel like I'm losing you. The room suddenly felt very still. Ethan sighed. Not sadly, not sympathetically. With irritation. The sound hit harder than any insult. Mom. There it was. That tone. The same tone that appeared whenever difficult conversations involved Vanessa. I don't know what you want from me. My chest tightened. I don't want anything. Then why do we keep having this conversation? Because you're my son. Because I love you. Because I barely recognize our relationship anymore. Those were the words inside my head. The words that never made it out. Instead, I said quietly, I'm trying to understand. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Then he said something that broke my heart. Maybe more than anything else had before. Maybe you need to stop making everything about yourself. I stared at him for a second. I genuinely thought I had misheard. What? His expression hardened. We can't keep living around your feelings. The words felt unreal. This wasn't the boy I raised. This wasn't the compassionate man I knew. This was someone speaking through years of influence. Years of carefully planted ideas. Years of subtle manipulation. Still, I tried. God help me, I tried. Ethan, I've never asked you to live around my feelings. Vanessa and I disagree. There it was. Not Ethan. Not his thoughts. Not his voice. Their thoughts. Their voice. their version of reality. My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. I hated crying in front of people. Always had. But grief doesn't ask permission. And in that moment, I wasn't crying because of what Ethan said. I was crying because I realized how completely I had lost him, the little boy who once held my hand crossing parking lots, the teenager who brought me flowers after Robert died, the young man who called every Sunday. He felt farther away than ever, and I didn't know how to reach him anymore. A tear rolled down my cheek, then another. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, almost annoyed, almost embarrassed, as if my sadness were creating inconvenience. At that exact moment, Vanessa entered the room. She looked from Ethan to me, immediately understanding something emotional was happening. "What did I miss?" she asked lightly. Neither of us answered. She studied my face, saw the tears, and smiled. For 1 second, I thought perhaps she would show compassion, maybe concern, maybe kindness. After all, even people who dislike each other usually show basic decency when someone is crying. Instead, she laughed. A short laugh. A sharp laugh. A laugh that escaped before she bothered hiding it. Not nervous laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. Not accidental laughter. A genuine laugh, the kind people make when they find something amusing. And somehow, my pain amused her. The sound wasn't loud. Most people in the house probably never heard it. But I did. Every note, every second. I watched her face, and for the first time, I saw something I had never fully seen before. Not confidence, not charm, not perfection. Contempt, pure contempt. In that instant, every excuse I had ever made for her disappeared. Every rationalization, every benefit of the doubt, every act of grace, gone. Because kind people don't laugh at suffering. They simply don't. Especially not the suffering of someone who has spent years helping them. I looked at Vanessa, then at Ethan. Waiting, praying, hoping. Surely he had heard it. Surely he would react. Surely he would say something, anything. He didn't. He just stood there, silent, and somehow that hurt even more than Vanessa's laughter. Because betrayal from an enemy is expected. Betrayal from your child is different. I wiped my eyes, took a slow breath, and something inside me changed. Not dramatically, not explosively, quietly, like a door closing. For years I had protected Vanessa. Protected her secret, protected her reputation, protected her marriage, and protected the lies. I had done it for Ethan, for family, for peace, for hope. Standing in that dining room, listening to her laugh at my pain while my son watched in silence, I finally understood something. Peace built on lies isn't peace. It's surrender. And I was done surrendering. Without another word, I picked up my coat. Ethan looked confused. "Mom," I turned toward the front door. Vanessa started. I didn't even look at her. For the first time in years, I had nothing left to say. Outside, snow drifted softly beneath the streetlights. The air was freezing, but somehow I felt calmer than I had in months. Maybe because a decision had finally been made. I drove home in silence, walked through my front door, past the family photographs lining the hallway, and climbed the stairs to my bedroom. At the back of my closet sat an old storage box. The box I hadn't opened in years. The box containing every document, every letter, every email, every record, every secret. I carried it downstairs and placed it on my kitchen table. Then I lifted the lid. For 3 years, I had protected Vanessa Parker Griffin from the truth. That night, I stopped, the box in my closet. For a long time after I opened the box, I simply stared at its contents. The house was silent. No television, no music, no distractions. Only the ticking of the old wall clock in my kitchen and the memories I had spent years trying to ignore. The cardboard box looked ordinary, worn corners, faded tape. Nothing about it suggested the power hidden inside, yet I knew better. Because inside that box was 3 years' worth of truth. And truth, when buried long enough, becomes dangerous. I sat down slowly and began removing the contents one item at a time. Folders, envelopes, bank statements, handwritten notes, copies of legal documents, emails I had printed and stored. Every piece represented a moment when I had chosen silence, a moment when I had convinced myself that protecting Ethan's marriage was more important than exposing reality. Looking at them now, I wasn't sure whether I had been compassionate or cowardly. Maybe both. The first folder contained records of the money I had given Ethan and Vanessa. Transfer confirmations, bank statements, payment records, years of financial support. As I flipped through the pages, I remembered every conversation, every promise that things would improve. Every time I told myself I was helping my son. What struck me most wasn't the amount, although the amount was substantial. What struck me was the pattern. I had given and given and given, while Vanessa had quietly accepted the credit. The realization still hurt. But strangely, it no longer hurt as much as Ethan's silence. Nothing hurt more than that. I set the folder aside and opened another. This one contained emails. Most were between me and Margaret Parker. Vanessa's mother. Reading them again felt like reopening old wounds. Margaret's messages were never dramatic, never manipulative. If anything, they were painfully restrained. One email described spending Thanksgiving alone in a nursing facility. Another described waiting 6 months for a phone call that never came. Another simply said, "I hope Vanessa is happy. I still pray for her every day." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Because despite everything she had suffered, Margaret still loved her daughter. That is the tragedy of parenthood. Love doesn't disappear simply because someone stops deserving it. Sometimes it survives far longer than it should. I knew that firsthand. Hadn't I spent years loving Ethan while watching him drift away? Hadn't I continued protecting Vanessa even while she hurt me? Parents endure things they would never tolerate from anyone else. Sometimes that endurance becomes a strength. Sometimes it becomes a weakness. Near the bottom of the box sat a large manila envelope. I hesitated before opening it, because I already knew what was inside. Margaret's letter. The letter that had changed everything. The letter I had not read in nearly 2 years. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the pages. The handwriting was uneven. fragile. The handwriting of someone whose health had begun failing. Dear Wanda, if you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to tell someone the truth. The words immediately pulled me back to the day I first received it. I continued reading. Margaret described years of disappointment, years of isolation, years of trying to maintain a relationship with Vanessa despite being pushed away repeatedly. There was no anger in the letter, only heartbreak, and that somehow made it worse. Anger can fade, heartbreak lingers. One paragraph nearly brought me to tears. I don't want revenge. I don't want money. I don't want anyone punished. I only want someone to know what happened to me before I'm gone. I lowered the letter and closed my eyes. Those words felt heavier now than they had years ago. Because Margaret had been right. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to stop pretending. Someone needed to speak. And somehow that responsibility had fallen to me. For 3 years, I had failed to carry it. The realization filled me with guilt. Not because I had intentionally done something wrong, because I had done nothing at all. Sometimes inaction causes as much damage as action. Maybe more. I poured myself a cup of coffee and continued sorting through documents. The deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Not just financial records, behavioral patterns, stories, contradictions. Evidence of a woman who carefully controlled how others saw her. Evidence of someone who understood that perception could be more powerful than reality. I wasn't collecting evidence for revenge. That distinction mattered. Because revenge had never interested me. What interested me was truth. Truth for Ethan. Truth for Margaret. Truth for myself. Around midnight, I found something I had forgotten existed. A small notebook. Inside were handwritten notes from conversations with Margaret. Dates, locations, details, specific events. One entry caught my attention immediately. I had written it nearly 3 years earlier. Margaret claims Vanessa sold family property without fully explaining terms. Witnesses available. I frowned. Witnesses, I'd completely forgotten that part. Quickly, I flipped through additional pages. More notes emerged. Names, phone numbers, references, people connected to Margaret's story, people I had never contacted. People I had chosen not to involve. At the time, I hadn't wanted to dig deeper. I had already learned enough to frighten me. Now, however, everything felt different because I was no longer trying to protect Vanessa. For the first time, I was willing to see the entire picture. I reached for my phone, then stopped. It was after midnight. Too late to call anyone, too late to begin. Instead, I wrote several names on a legal pad. Potential witnesses. Former neighbors. An attorney Margaret once mentioned, people who might know more, people who might confirm details or disprove them. Either way, I needed facts, not assumptions. Facts. By 2 a.m, exhaustion settled into my bones. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. Photographs covered the walls. Robert, Ethan, family vacations, birthday celebrations, a lifetime of memories. One photo captured Ethan at age 10. He stood beside a fishing lake, proudly holding a fish half his size. His smile radiated pure joy. I found myself staring at that picture. remembering who he used to be, remembering who we used to be, and wondering whether that version of my son still existed somewhere beneath all the lies. A painful thought crossed my mind. What if he never forgives me? The possibility was real. Exposing Vanessa could destroy his marriage, even if the truth justified it. Even if the evidence proved it, people don't always thank the person who reveals painful truths. Sometimes they blame them. Sometimes they hate them. For a moment, fear returned. The same fear that had kept me silent for 3 years. The fear of losing Ethan forever. But then another memory surfaced. Vanessa laughing. Not nervous laughter, not accidental laughter, cruel laughter. The memory hardened my resolve, because protecting her had already cost me almost everything. How much more was I willing to lose? The answer surprised me. Nothing. I was done losing, done pretending, done sacrificing reality for appearances. I carefully returned the documents to the box, not to hide them again, to organize them, to prepare. Because the next step was obvious. Before I spoke to Ethan, before I confronted Vanessa, before I revealed anything, I needed to see Margaret. I needed to hear her story again. Not from old letters, not from faded notes, directly. Face to face. And deep down, I suspected that conversation would uncover something even bigger than I already knew, something capable of changing everything. I found her mother again. The nursing home sat on the edge of a small town nearly 2 hours from Columbus. It wasn't the kind of place anyone dreamed of spending their final years. The building itself wasn't falling apart. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't dangerous. But it was lonely. Painfully lonely. As I pulled into the parking lot on a gray January morning, I felt a heaviness settle over me. The sky hung low with thick winter clouds. A cold wind swept across the empty pavement. The entire place seemed forgotten. And somehow that felt appropriate. Forgotten people often end up in forgotten places. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. A television played quietly in the corner. Several residents sat in wheelchairs staring at nothing in particular. Some looked tired, some looked confused, some looked as though they had been waiting a very long time for someone who never came. The sight broke my heart. After checking in at the front desk, I followed a nurse down a hallway lined with faded photographs. When we reached Margaret Parker's room, the nurse knocked softly. "Margaret, you have a visitor." A weak voice answered. "Come in." I opened the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Margaret looked older than I remembered. Much older. The last time I'd seen her in person had been almost 3 years earlier. Back then, she had looked tired. Now she looked fragile. Her silver hair had thinned considerably. Her shoulders appeared smaller. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat in a chair beside the window. But her eyes remained sharp, very sharp. The moment she recognized me, tears filled them. "Wanda." I walked forward and embraced her. She felt heartbreakingly light, like a person carrying far more sadness than strength. "It's good to see you," I said. She smiled weakly. I wasn't sure I would. The comment lingered in the room. A reminder that time wasn't unlimited anymore. Neither of us mentioned it. Instead, we talked. At first, The conversation stayed light. Weather, health, the holidays. Small topics people use when avoiding larger ones. But eventually, we both knew why I had come. Margaret noticed the folder in my lap. Her expression changed. "You finally opened the box." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Yeah." A long silence followed. Then she sighed. "I always wondered when that day would come." I pulled my chair closer. "Margaret, I need to know everything." For a moment, she simply stared out the window. Snowflakes drifted slowly beyond the glass. Then she began speaking. Not quickly, not dramatically, just honestly. The story unfolded over several hours. And with each detail, my stomach tightened. According to Margaret, Vanessa's behavior hadn't changed suddenly. It had developed over years. Even as a teenager, Vanessa possessed a remarkable ability to control how others saw her. Teachers adored her, neighbors praised her, friends admired her. Meanwhile, anyone who challenged her became the problem. Margaret described countless situations where reality somehow shifted to benefit Vanessa. Arguments became misunderstandings. Mistakes became someone else's fault. Consequences became evidence of unfair treatment. The pattern sounded disturbingly familiar, because I had watched the same thing happen in my own life. Only now I could see the pattern more clearly. She wasn't born evil, Margaret said quietly. The statement surprised me, Margaret noticed. "You expected me to hate her." I hesitated. A little. A sad smile appeared. "She's still my daughter." There it was again. That painful truth only parents fully understand. Love survives even when trust dies. Margaret reached for a glass of water. Her hands shook slightly. After taking a sip, she continued. "When her father died, something changed." I listened carefully. Vanessa had been 22, ambitious, driven, focused on success. At first, Margaret admired those qualities. Then they began consuming everything else. Relationships became transactions. People became opportunities. Loyalty became conditional. The more Vanessa succeeded professionally, the less patience she seemed to have for anyone who needed help, including her own mother. As the years passed, Margaret's health deteriorated. Medical expenses increased. Managing paperwork became difficult. Naturally, she turned to her daughter, the person she trusted most. The irony was painful. Margaret described signing documents she barely understood, allowing Vanessa access to financial information, trusting her to help. Instead, assets slowly disappeared. Property changed hands. Accounts shifted. Control moved away from Margaret and toward Vanessa. Legally, many of the actions existed in gray areas. Morally, they did not. By the time Margaret realized what had happened, much of her independence was gone. The more she resisted, the less contact Vanessa allowed. The more questions she asked, the more isolated she became. Eventually, family members stopped hearing Margaret's version of events altogether. They only heard Vanessa's. The exact same thing had happened with Ethan. The realization made my blood run cold. Then Margaret revealed something that completely changed the direction of our conversation. Wanda, her voice lowered. There's something else. Immediately, I knew this mattered. What is it? She hesitated. For the first time all day, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Does Ethan know about Daniel? The name hit me instantly. Daniel, the name from my notebook. The name connected to one of the old notes. No. Margaret closed her eyes. Of course he doesn't. I leaned forward. Who is Daniel? The answer came quietly. Vanessa's first husband. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. What? Margaret nodded. She was married before. I stared at her. Because Ethan had always described himself as Vanessa's first husband, her only husband, her only... the love of her life. Everything suddenly felt unstable. Why would she hide that? Margaret laughed bitterly. Because the marriage didn't end the way she tells people. My pulse quickened. Tell me. Margaret looked exhausted. But she continued. Daniel Cooper had married Vanessa nearly 15 years earlier. The relationship followed a pattern that now felt terrifyingly familiar. Fast romance. Deep emotional attachment. Increasing control. Isolation from family. Financial entanglement. Eventually, the marriage collapsed. Officially, Vanessa claimed Daniel had been controlling and emotionally abusive. That was the story most people believed. According to Margaret, however, the truth was far more complicated. Much more complicated. When the divorce ended, Daniel lost substantial assets, lost contact with many friends, lost trust in nearly everyone around him. The details sounded eerily familiar, almost identical to what I had watched happen to Ethan. Margaret noticed my expression. You see it now, don't you? I nodded slowly. For the first time, I truly did. Not isolated incidents, not misunderstandings, a pattern, a system, a way of operating, a way of controlling people while appearing innocent. Then Margaret said something that chilled me completely. I heard from someone recently. What do you mean? She swallowed hard. They told me Vanessa has been preparing documents involving Ethan's house. The room suddenly felt colder. My heartbeat accelerated. What kind of documents? I don't know. Her voice trembled. But I know that look. What look? The look she gets when she's planning something. I sat frozen. Because suddenly dozens of small memories aligned. Conversations about refinancing. Discussions about property values. Vanessa's increasing interest in real estate investments. Things that had seemed harmless now looked different, potentially dangerous. Margaret reached across the small table and placed her hand over mine. Wanda, I looked at her. If you still want to save your son, you need to act now. The words landed heavily between us, not dramatic, not emotional, simply true. For years, I had protected Vanessa. For years, I had waited for things to improve and stun. For years, I had chosen silence. Now, sitting across from a lonely mother abandoned by the daughter she still loved, I finally understood the cost of that silence. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to find Daniel Cooper, because if Margaret was right, Daniel wasn't just part of Vanessa's past. He was a warning about Ethan's future. The man before my son, for 3 days after visiting Margaret. I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Cooper. The name echoed in my mind like an unfinished sentence. Vanessa's first husband. A man Ethan didn't even know existed. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. How do you marry someone and never mention an entire marriage? How does a person erase something that's significant from their life story? The answer, I suspected, was simple. You erase it because the truth is inconvenient. And inconvenient truths had a habit of following Vanessa wherever she went. Fortunately, Margaret still had an old phone number for Daniel. Whether it still worked was another question. I stared at the number for nearly 10 minutes before dialing. Part of me hoped nobody would answer. Part of me feared someone would. After 4 rings, a man picked up. "Hello," his voice sounded cautious, older, tired. "Daniel Cooper." A pause. "Yeah." "My name is Wanda Griffin." Silence. Then, "I don't think I know you." "You don't." I swallowed. "But I know Vanessa Parker Griffin." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Long enough to tell me everything. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Not angry. Guarded. Very guarded. "What about her?" I took a deep breath. "I'm Ethan Griffin's mother." Another pause. Then a quiet sigh. A heavy sigh. The kind that comes from old wounds. Oh. I immediately knew. Margaret had been telling the truth, and Daniel knew exactly who Vanessa was. And judging by his reaction, remembering her wasn't pleasant. To my surprise, he agreed to meet, not enthusiastically, no, not immediately. But after a long conversation, he finally said, maybe it's time somebody talked. We arranged to meet 2 days later. The meeting took place at a small coffee shop outside Dayton. Daniel arrived 10 minutes early. I recognized him immediately, not because I had ever seen him before, because he looked exactly like someone carrying old scars. He appeared to be in his mid-40s. Professional, well-groomed, quiet, the type of man who had learned to observe before speaking. When he sat down across from me, neither of us rushed the conversation. We started with small talk, weather, travel, coffee, the usual subjects strangers discuss before entering dangerous territory. Eventually, Daniel looked directly at me. "You want to know about Vanessa?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. His expression hardened slightly. "Why now?" The answer deserved honesty, because I think my son is in trouble. See, for the first time, genuine sympathy appeared in Daniel's eyes. Not satisfaction, not revenge, sympathy. And somehow that frightened me more than anger would have, because sympathy suggested he understood exactly what I meant. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Then he began telling me a story that felt disturbingly familiar. When I met Vanessa, she was incredible. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because I had said nearly those exact words myself years earlier. Daniel smiled bitterly. I know that look. What look? The look people get when they realize they've heard the same story before. I nodded slowly. Daniel continued. At first, Vanessa was everything he wanted. Charming, attentive, supportive, ambitious. She remembered details, made him feel important, made him feel understood. Within a year, they were engaged. Within 2 years, they were married. The beginning sounded almost identical to Ethan's relationship. Then the pattern changed. Gradually, carefully, almost invisibly. Vanessa began questioning his friends, questioning his family, questioning his decisions. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Small comments, subtle observations, tiny doubts. Over time, those doubts grew. Daniel found himself spending less time with people who cared about him. Less time with family, less time with lifelong friends. At first, he believed those choices were his own. Years later, he realized many of them weren't. I listened silently, because I had watched something similar happen with Ethan. The details differed. The pattern did not. Then Daniel said something that made my stomach tighten. She never directly told me what to do. I frowned. What do you mean? That's what makes people like her difficult to explain. He paused. She didn't control me. Another pause. She convinced me I was controlling myself. The statement lingered between us. Powerful, terrifying, because it perfectly described what I had witnessed. Vanessa rarely demanded. She suggested. She implied. She nudged. She guided. Until people believed her ideas were their own. Daniel took a sip of coffee. Then his expression darkened. The financial problems started later. I immediately paid attention. This mattered. According to Daniel, Vanessa gradually became involved in every financial decision. Accounts, investments, property, business matters, everything. At first, it seemed logical. They were married, partners, building a future together. Then strange things began happening. Documents appeared without discussion. Financial choices were made unexpectedly. Money moved. Explanations became vague. Questions triggered arguments. Eventually, Daniel realized he no longer fully understood his own finances. By then, it was too late. The divorce followed shortly afterward. I hesitated before asking the next question. What happened? Daniel laughed softly. Not happily. The laugh of someone remembering disappointment. Depends who tells the story. I waited. My version. I nodded. He looked directly at me. I finally started asking questions. The simplicity of the answer sent chills through me. Just questions. Not accusations. Not threats. Questions. And apparently that had been enough. Daniel explained that once he challenged Vanessa's narrative, everything changed. Friends disappeared. Allies vanished. Suddenly he became the villain. The controlling husband. The difficult partner. The problem. The exact same thing had happened to Margaret. The exact same thing was happening to me. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Then Daniel opened a folder he had brought with him. My heart skipped, because I immediately recognized the expression on his face. The expression of someone who had once needed proof to defend reality. Inside the folder were documents, emails, Financial records, legal paperwork, not enough to prove criminal wrongdoing, but enough to reveal behavior, enough to reveal patterns, enough to raise serious questions. As I reviewed the documents, one detail caught my attention immediately. Several real estate transactions, property-related paperwork, investment discussions. The same topics Margaret had mentioned. The same topics Vanessa had recently discussed with Ethan. My pulse quickened. Daniel. He looked up. Yes. Did Vanessa ever try to sell property without fully explaining what she was doing? A dark look crossed his face. More than once, the room suddenly felt colder. Because now two separate people had described nearly identical behavior. Margaret. Daniel. People who had never coordinated stories. People whose lives barely overlapped. Yet their experiences mirrored each other. That wasn't coincidence. That was evidence. Then Daniel said something that made my blood run cold. I don't know your son. He leaned forward. But if she's still the same person, he hesitated. Watch the house. I stared at him. What? The house. His voice lowered. That's always where the biggest money is. The words hit me like a punch. Because Margaret had said something remarkably similar. And suddenly dozens of conversations resurfaced in my memory. Vanessa talking about refinancing, home equity, investment opportunities, market timing, property appreciation. At the time, they sounded harmless. Now they sounded dangerous, very dangerous. And Daniel studied my face, then quietly asked, "How much does your son know?" The answer broke my heart. Almost nothing. Daniel closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. Then you don't have much time? The statement hung heavily in the air. And deep down, I knew he was right. Because for the first time, this wasn't just about the past. It wasn't just about Margaret, or Daniel, or me. This was about Ethan, my son, and if the evidence was pointing where I thought it was pointing, Vanessa wasn't merely rewriting history anymore. She was preparing something new, something far more dangerous. And I needed proof before it was too late. The final family meeting. There comes a moment when you realize the truth will hurt no matter what you do. You can hide it, you can delay it, you can soften it, but eventually, the truth demands a seat at the table. After meeting Daniel Cooper, I spent nearly 2 weeks organizing everything. Every document, every email, every letter, every financial record, every note. I wasn't building a case for court. I was building a case for reality. Because one thing had become painfully clear. Vanessa had spent years controlling the story. If I wanted Ethan to see the truth, I couldn't rely on emotions. Emotions could be dismissed. Facts could not. At least that was my hope. I rented a private meeting room at a community center on a Saturday afternoon. Neutral ground. No one's home. No one's territory. No excuses. Then I made the calls. First, Ethan. His reaction was cautious. What's this about? We need to talk. His sigh told me he already expected conflict. Mom, please. A long silence followed. Finally, he agreed. Then I called Vanessa. She sounded surprisingly cheerful, almost amused. "Of course we'll come." The confidence in her voice immediately worried me, because confident people believe they're safe, and Vanessa had spent years believing she was untouchable. I also invited Linda, Pastor Michael Reed, and, with some hesitation, Margaret. At first, Margaret refused. Her health was declining. Travel exhausted her, but after several conversations, she finally agreed. Not for revenge, for closure. The last person I invited was Daniel. His answer came quickly. "I'll be there." By Saturday morning, I barely slept. I kept questioning myself. Was I doing the right thing? Was I about to destroy my son's marriage? Was I helping him or hurting him? The doubts were relentless. But every time fear gained strength, I remembered Vanessa laughing while I cried. Not because I wanted revenge, because that moment had revealed who she truly was. And once you see the truth, pretending becomes impossible. The meeting began at 2:00. I arrived early. The room itself was simple. A long conference table and neutral walls and bright lighting. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Exactly what I wanted. By 1:50, Linda arrived. She hugged me tightly. "You okay?" "No," she smiled sadly. "Good." I blinked. "What?" "If you weren't scared, I'd be worried." For the first time all morning. I laughed. A small laugh, but it helped. At 2:00 sharp, Ethan and Vanessa entered. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Vanessa looked relaxed, almost confident. She walked into the room with the calm smile she always wore when she believed she controlled the situation. When she noticed the folders on the table, she raised an eyebrow. "What's all this?" I simply smiled. "You'll see." Her confidence never wavered. That would change soon enough. A few minutes later, Pastor Reed arrived, then Margaret. The moment Vanessa saw her mother, something flashed across her face. Not fear, not yet. Shock. Real shock. For perhaps the first time since I'd known her. She looked genuinely unprepared. Mom Margaret said nothing. She simply took a seat. The room grew noticeably colder. Then Daniel entered, and everything changed. Vanessa stood immediately. The color drained from her face. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Daniel nodded politely. "Vanessa." The sound of her name in his voice felt like a ghost walking into the room. Ethan looked completely confused. His eyes moved from Daniel to Vanessa, then back again. "What is going on?" I took a slow breath. The moment had arrived. For years, I had feared this conversation. Now there was no turning back. I stood. "Thank you all for coming." Nobody answered. The silence itself felt heavy. I continued. "For years, I've remained quiet." My eyes found Ethan. I stayed quiet because I love my son. Then I looked at Vanessa. and because I hoped people could change. Vanessa crossed her arms. Toot. I have no idea what this is about. I nodded. That's okay. Then I opened the first folder. Immediately, Ethan looked nervous. Vanessa looked irritated. The difference mattered. Nervous people fear what they don't know. Irritated people fear losing control. I began with the simplest evidence. The financial records, transfer confirmations, bank statements, payment histories, every dollar I had quietly given them over the years. I placed copies in front of Ethan. At first, he looked confused, then surprised, then deeply uncomfortable. Mom. I raised a hand gently. Please let me finish. For once, he listened. I explained each payment calmly. No accusations, no emotional speeches, only facts, dates, amounts, documents, proof, Vanessa interrupted repeatedly. Why are we talking about this? I ignored her. The documents spoke for themselves. Then came the second folder. Emails, messages, evidence showing how often Vanessa accepted credit for support she had never provided. For the first time, Ethan began looking at his wife differently. Not with suspicion, not yet, but with uncertainty. The certainty she had spent years building was beginning to crack. That alone was significant. Then Vanessa laughed, a small laugh, dismissive. Oh my God, she rolled her eyes. Are we seriously doing this, Sal? The reaction surprised nobody except Ethan. Because everyone else in the room had already seen behind the mask. Only Ethan still wanted to believe. Then I opened the third folder. The room became silent. Margaret lowered her eyes. Daniel folded his hands. Even Pastor Reed seemed tense. Ethan noticed. What is this? I looked directly at him. This is the part I hoped you'd never need to hear. Vanessa's face hardened instantly. For the first time all afternoon, genuine concern appeared. Not concern for me. Not concern for Ethan. Concern for herself. I carefully removed several documents. Then I placed a photograph on the table. A wedding photograph. Vanessa. And Daniel. Ethan stared at it. For several seconds, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then realization hit. His face turned pale. The room remained completely silent. What is this? Nobody answered immediately. Because some truths deserve a moment of silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. It's our wedding photo. The words landed like a bomb. Ethan looked at Vanessa, then at Daniel, then back at Vanessa. Your wedding photo? Vanessa's lips parted. No words came out. Not yet. For the first time since entering the room, she looked afraid. Actually afraid. I watched Ethan's entire world begin shifting beneath his feet. Because this wasn't merely a secret. It was proof. Proof that the story he'd been told wasn't complete. Proof that important things had been hidden. Proof that maybe, just maybe, the people he trusted weren't telling him everything. And we were only getting started. Because the photograph was the smallest revelation in the room. The truly devastating evidence was still waiting inside the folders. And before this meeting ended, Vanessa Parker Griffin's carefully crafted image would begin falling apart piece by piece. The truth finally collapsed. The moment Ethan saw the wedding photograph, something shifted inside the room. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the foundation of certainty that Vanessa had built over the years began to crack. And once certainty cracks, questions start pouring through. Questions are dangerous to people who survive by controlling answers. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Ethan stared at the photograph as if looking at something impossible. Then he looked at Vanessa. "You were married before?" His voice sounded small, confused, not angry, not yet. Vanessa recovered quickly, too quickly. That was one of her gifts. She could adapt faster than almost anyone I'd ever met. "Yes." The answer came calmly. As if hiding an entire marriage from her husband were a minor oversight. Ethan blinked. "You never told me." Vanessa crossed her arms. "It wasn't relevant." The room remained silent. I watched Ethan process those words. Not relevant. A previous marriage, a husband, a divorce, an entire chapter of life, and not relevant. Even Ethan seemed unable to accept that explanation. "You never thought I should know." Immediately, Vanessa shifted tactics. I recognized the move because I had seen it before. She wasn't answering the question. She was changing the emotional direction of the conversation. You know how painful that period was for me. There it was. Victimhood. The familiar shield. The familiar escape route. Normally it worked. This time it didn't. Because Daniel was sitting only a few feet away. A living contradiction. A living witness. A living reminder that every story has more than one side. Daniel remained calm. Remarkably calm. His restraint impressed me. Most people would have been angry if he's bitter, defensive. Daniel simply waited. Then Ethan looked toward him. "What happened?" Daniel hesitated. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Instead, he spoke carefully. "I think that's something Vanessa should explain." A smart answer. A fair answer. But Vanessa didn't explain. She attacked. Immediately. "Of course you'd say that." Daniel didn't react. She continued. "You always loved playing the victim." The irony was almost breathtaking. Even Pastor Reed shifted uncomfortably, because everyone in the room could see what was happening. The moment facts appeared, Vanessa abandoned explanation and moved toward character attacks. It was a pattern, and for the first time, Ethan was witnessing it directly. I opened another folder. "Let's stay focused." Vanessa shot me a look full of anger. For years, that look might have intimidated me. Not anymore. I carefully removed several documents. Property records, transfer records, correspondence. Nothing sensational. Nothing dramatic. Just evidence. I handed copies to Ethan. He looked increasingly overwhelmed. As he reviewed the paperwork, confusion slowly transformed into concern. Then concern became alarm. "What is this?" Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was weak but steady. "That's the property you convinced me to sign over." The room froze. Vanessa immediately turned toward her mother. "I told you why that happened." Margaret nodded sadly. Yes. A pause. You told me. The sentence carried far more weight than a simple agreement. Because everyone understood what she meant. Vanessa always had an explanation. The problem was that explanations aren't the same thing as truth. For nearly an hour, the conversation continued, document after document, record after record, fact after fact. No single piece destroyed Vanessa's credibility. That wasn't how deception works. Instead, a pattern emerged, and patterns are difficult to defend, especially when multiple unrelated people describe the same behavior. Margaret, Daniel, me, 3 different relationships, 3 different time periods, 3 different experiences. Yet somehow the stories sounded remarkably similar. Control, manipulation, isolation, financial influence, rewriting reality. Eventually, Ethan stopped reading. He simply sat staring at the table. His face looked pale, older somehow. The expression reminded me of someone waking from a long dream. Not because he suddenly understood everything, because he suddenly realized he understood far less than he thought. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not for Vanessa, for Ethan. He looked directly at me, then asked a question that nearly broke my heart. Mom. His voice cracked slightly. Why didn't you tell me? The room went silent. Every eye turned toward me. I swallowed hard, because the answer wasn't flattering. I was trying to protect you. Ethan looked devastated. From what? The truth? For a moment, neither of us spoke. Years of pain stood between us, years of misunderstandings, years of silence. Finally, I continued. I thought if I stayed quiet, your marriage might survive. A tear slipped down my cheek. I thought maybe things would get better. Another pause. I thought exposing everything would hurt you. The sadness on Ethan's face deepened. Then he asked the question I had feared most. Did you know all this when we were fighting? I closed my eyes briefly. Most of it. The answer hurt him. I could see it immediately. And honestly, it should have. Because my silence hadn't protected him. It had abandoned him. The realization hit me with painful clarity. For years, I had believed I was making sacrifices for my son. Instead, I had allowed him to live inside a carefully constructed illusion. An illusion that kept growing stronger. Vanessa sensed the shift immediately. She understood something dangerous was happening. Not the evidence, not the documents, the emotional connection. Ethan was listening to me again. Actually listening. That terrified her, so she did what she always did. She escalated. Suddenly she stood. This is ridiculous. Nobody moved. Nobody answered. She pointed toward Daniel. You brought my ex-husband, then toward Margaret. My mother hates me, then toward me. And you've been obsessed with destroying me for years. The accusations filled the room, loud, emotional, chaotic. Yet something was different now. Nobody seemed convinced, not even Ethan. Because once someone catches a glimpse behind the curtain, the performance loses power. Ethan slowly stood. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. Then he asked a question, one simple question, the kind of question honest people answer directly. Did you ever tell me about Daniel? Vanessa froze. No answer. Ethan continued. Did you tell me about the property transfers with your mother? Still no answer. His voice became firmer. Did you tell me my mother gave us most of that money? Silence. The room felt almost unbearable. Because everyone already knew the answers. The problem wasn't the answers. The problem was that Vanessa couldn't say them aloud. Finally, she whispered, it's more complicated than that. Ethan laughed softly, not a happy laugh. A broken laugh. The sound hurt more than shouting would have, because it carried disappointment. And disappointment is far harder to repair than anger. Then he said something I will never forget. Everything is always more complicated when the truth starts showing up. The room went completely silent. Vanessa looked stunned. I did too, because for the first time in years, I heard my son again. Not Vanessa's influence, not Vanessa's language, not Vanessa's interpretation. My son, the thoughtful man I had raised, the man who cared about honesty, the man who believed actions mattered, the man I thought I had lost. And in that moment, I realized something important. This meeting wasn't about proving Vanessa was guilty. It was about giving Ethan enough truth to start asking his own questions. Because real change doesn't happen when someone else convinces you. It happens when you finally see for yourself. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Nobody shouted. Nobody threw accusations. Nobody created a scene. The damage was already done. The truth had entered the room. And truth rarely leaves quietly. As people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Ethan remained seated, staring at the documents, staring at years of hidden reality, staring at a marriage he suddenly wasn't sure he understood. And deep down, I knew the hardest conversation was still ahead of him. Because discovering the truth is painful. But deciding what to do with it, that's where the real heartbreak begins. My son came home. People imagine reconciliation as a beautiful moment. A hug, an apology, tears, forgiveness. Then everyone lives happily ever after. Real life rarely works that way. Real healing is messier, slower, more painful, and far less romantic. 3 days passed after the family meeting, then 4, then 5. I didn't hear from Ethan. Part of me wasn't surprised. His entire world had collapsed in a single afternoon. A marriage he trusted, a wife he defended, a reality he believed. All of it had been shaken. No matter what happened next, he would need time. So I waited. Not because waiting was easy, because I had finally learned that some battles cannot be fought for other people. Ethan needed to make his own choices, his own discoveries, his own mistakes. For years, I had protected him from painful truths. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. On the 6th evening, my doorbell rang. The sound startled me. I wasn't expecting company. When I opened the front door, my breath caught. Ethan stood on the porch, alone. The first thing I noticed was how exhausted he looked. His eyes were red. Dark circles sat beneath them. His shoulders seemed heavier, as though he had aged several years in a single week. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Of course. The moment he entered the house, memories flooded through me. This hallway, this living room, this kitchen, the house where he had grown up, the house where he learned to ride a bicycle, the house where he celebrated birthdays, the house where he cried after losing his father, home. For several minutes, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Neither of us seemed sure where to begin. Finally, Ethan spoke. I left. The words landed softly, yet they carried enormous weight. I swallowed. When yesterday, a long silence followed. I had imagined this moment many times, but now that it had arrived, I felt no victory here, no satisfaction, only sadness. Because a broken marriage is still a broken marriage, even when leaving is the right choice. Ethan stared down at his coffee. I found more. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He laughed bitterly. The sound hurt, not because it was cruel and because it was broken. I kept digging. I nodded slowly. That didn't surprise me. Once doubt enters your mind, it demands answers. And Ethan had finally started asking questions. Over the next hour, he told me everything. The conversations, the arguments, the discoveries, bank records he had never examined, documents he had signed without fully reviewing, financial discussions he now viewed differently, promises that suddenly sounded suspicious. Every answer had led to more questions. Every question had revealed another inconsistency, not enough to explain everything. More than enough to destroy trust. I don't even know what's real anymore. The pain in his voice nearly broke me because I understood exactly what he meant. Manipulation doesn't only damage relationships, it damages reality. It makes people question their memories, their judgment, their instincts, their own minds. For years, Ethan had trusted Vanessa's interpretation of events. Now he was realizing how much of that interpretation had been carefully shaped. And he didn't know what to believe anymore. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. For the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry." The words came out as a whisper. I felt my chest tighten. "Ethan." "No." He shook his head. "I need to say this." His voice cracked. "I was awful to you." I opened my mouth and nothing came out, because hearing those words hurt almost as much as not hearing them. For years I had wanted acknowledgement, validation, recognition. Now that it was finally happening, all I felt was grief. Grief for the years we lost. Grief for the conversations we never had. Grief for the damage that didn't need to happen. Tears rolled down Ethan's face. I should have listened. I reached across the table and took his hand. The same hand I had held when he was a little boy. The same hand I had held at his father's funeral. The same hand I thought I might never hold again. We both made mistakes. He shook his head. Not like mine. I understood why he felt that way. But healing doesn't begin with assigning permanent blame. It begins with honesty, and honesty required me to admit my own failures too. So I took a deep breath. Then I told him the truth. I failed you. His eyes widened. What? I should have told you years ago. The words hurt, but they were true. I knew things were wrong. I paused. I just kept hoping they would get better. Ethan stared at me silently. I thought I was protecting you. Another pause. I wasn't. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan nodded. Not because he agreed completely, because he understood. For the first time in years, we were speaking honestly, not defending, not attacking, not pretending, just telling the truth. The conversation lasted for hours. We talked about everything. Robert, the past, the marriage, the family meeting, the years we had lost, the pain we had both carried. At one point, Ethan asked a question I never expected. Do you forgive me? I looked at him carefully. Because forgiveness is complicated, especially after years of hurt. Finally, I answered honestly. Yes. Relief flashed across his face. Then I continued. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as pretending nothing happened. His expression changed. Not hurt, thoughtful. I nodded. I love you. A pause. And I forgive you. Another pause. But we need to rebuild trust. The words mattered. Because forgiveness without boundaries creates new wounds. I had learned that lesson the hard way. For years, I had confused love with sacrifice. Compassion with silence. Patience with self-neglect. I wasn't going to repeat those mistakes. Not with Vanessa. Not with Ethan. Not with anyone. To my surprise, Ethan nodded. I understand. And I believed him. Because for the first time in a very long time, he sounded like himself, not manipulated, not defensive, not influenced, just honest. As evening settled outside, we moved into the living room. The old family photo album sat on a nearby shelf. Ethan picked one up. Soon we found ourselves flipping through decades of memories. Birthday parties, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, school graduations, photographs of Robert. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the house. Gentle laughter, healing laughter, the kind that comes after surviving something painful. Not because the pain disappears, because you're finally strong enough to carry it. Before leaving that night, Ethan stopped at the front door. Then he turned toward me. I don't know what happens next. Neither did I. The divorce wasn't finalized. The future remained uncertain. The damage wasn't magically repaired. But for the first time in years, uncertainty didn't frighten me. Because truth was finally present. And truth gives people something solid to stand on, even when everything else feels unstable. I smiled. You don't have to know yet. He nodded. Then he hugged me. A real hug, not polite, not forced. The kind of hug that says what words can't. When he finally left, I stood in the doorway watching his car disappear down the street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was losing my son. I felt like I had found him. But the most important lesson was still waiting for me. Because rebuilding a relationship is one thing. Understanding why it broke in the first place is another. And over the months that followed, I would learn a truth far deeper than anything Vanessa had ever hidden. A truth about love, about silence, and about the price people pay when they confuse peace with protection. The truth set us free. People often think justice looks like punishment. A courtroom, a public humiliation, a dramatic downfall. For a long time, I thought that too. But life has a way of teaching lessons differently. Sometimes justice isn't about watching someone suffer. Sometimes it's about finally stopping their ability to hurt others. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply finding peace again. 6 months after the family meeting, my life looked very different. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but different, healthier, quieter, more honest. The divorce proceedings between Ethan and Vanessa were still moving through the legal system. Those things take time. Lawyers became involved. Financial reviews were conducted. Documents were examined. Questions were asked. Many questions, far more than Ethan ever imagined. The deeper professionals looked, the more complicated things became. I won't discuss every detail. Some parts belong to Ethan's private life. Others belong in legal records rather than family stories. What matters is this: the truth continued revealing itself. Piece by piece, layer by layer, and every new discovery confirmed what we had already learned. The family meeting had not been based on misunderstandings. It had been based on reality. Ironically, that realization brought Ethan both pain and relief. Pain because nobody wants to discover they were manipulated. Relief because he finally understood he wasn't losing his mind. One afternoon, he said something that stayed with me. "Mom, I spent years thinking I was failing everyone." We were sitting on my back porch, the same porch where Robert and I used to drink coffee together. I listened quietly. Ethan stared into the distance. Every conflict felt like my fault. A pause. Every problem somehow became my responsibility. Another pause. I thought I just wasn't trying hard enough. My heart broke hearing those words, because I remembered feeling something similar myself. Manipulation often creates guilt. Guilt creates confusion. And confused people become easier to control. Now that Ethan stood outside that environment, he could finally see it. Not all at once. Healing never works that way. But gradually, steadily, the fog was lifting. And with every passing week, more of my son returned. Not the child, not the young man from decades ago. A wiser version, a stronger version. A man who had survived something difficult and learned from it. Our relationship improved too. Slowly, naturally, without forcing anything. The weekly phone calls returned. Not because I demanded them, because Ethan wanted them. Sunday afternoons became ours again. Sometimes we discussed serious topics, sometimes we argued, sometimes we laughed. Normal things, healthy things. For the first time in years, our relationship felt real. Not perfect, real, and real is far better than perfect. One of the happiest changes involved Margaret. Shortly after the family meeting, I began visiting her regularly. At first, she seemed surprised, almost suspicious. People who have experienced abandonment often struggle trusting kindness. But over time, she relaxed. The loneliness that had shadowed her for years slowly began fading. Eventually, with Ethan's help, we found a much better assisted living community closer to Columbus. A smaller place, a warmer place, a place where people actually knew her name. The day she moved in remains one of my favorite memories. As we unpacked her belongings, Margaret sat quietly watching. Then tears filled her eyes. "What's wrong?" I asked. She smiled. For a moment, she looked younger. "Lately, I keep forgetting what it feels like to matter." The sentence nearly broke me. Because every human being deserves to matter. Every mother, every father, every grandparent, every person. Nobody should spend their final years feeling invisible. From that day forward, Margaret became part of our extended family. Not because she shared our last name, because she shared our hearts. Watching Ethan help her settle into her new home healed something inside me. It reminded me of the compassionate boy I raised, the boy who once carried groceries for elderly neighbors, the boy who volunteered after school, the boy who cared deeply about people. That person had never disappeared. He had simply been buried beneath years of influence and confusion. As spring turned into summer, life continued moving forward. And with distance came perspective. Perspective changes everything. For years, I believed my greatest mistake was trusting Vanessa. I eventually realized that wasn't true. Trusting people isn't a mistake. Trust is part of love, part of hope, part of being human. The real mistake was remaining silent after discovering the truth, not because I owed anyone revenge, because silence helped nobody. Not Ethan, not Margaret, not me, certainly not Vanessa. In fact, silence allowed the damage to continue growing. That lesson was difficult to accept, because many people of my generation were taught to keep peace at any cost. Don't make waves, don't create conflict, don't embarrass people, stay quiet, be polite, endure. But there's a difference between peace and surrender. I learned that far too late on. Real peace requires honesty. Real peace requires boundaries. Real peace requires courage. Without those things, peace becomes an illusion, a performance, a mask. And masks always crack eventually. One evening near the end of summer, Ethan and I visited Robert's grave. It had become a tradition after his death. Some years we talked, some years we simply sat quietly. That evening felt different, lighter. The air smelled of freshly cut grass. A gentle breeze moved through the cemetery. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan smiled softly. "Dad would have hated all this drama." I laughed. A real laugh. Absolutely. He would have told us both to stop being stubborn. Also true. For a moment, we simply smiled. Then Ethan looked toward the headstone. "I think he'd be proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I shook my head. "I don't know about that." "Mom," his voice grew serious, You told the truth when it mattered. A lump formed in my throat. Because for years I had focused on my failures, the years of silence, the mistakes, the regrets. Maybe I needed to remember something else, too. Eventually, I had found the courage to act. Late, imperfectly. But I acted. And sometimes imperfect courage is enough. As we prepared to leave, I glanced one final time at Robert's headstone. Then I looked at my son, healthy, healing, free. Not because everything ended perfectly, no, because the lies had ended. Truth had finally entered our lives. And truth, even painful truth, creates freedom. Driving home that evening, I realized something unexpected. I no longer hated Vanessa. I didn't trust her. I didn't excuse her choices. But hatred had quietly disappeared. Hatred is exhausting. Healing leaves little room for it. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. Sadness for opportunities wasted. Relationships destroyed. Love rejected. Lives complicated unnecessarily. But those were her choices. Not mine. Not Ethan's. Not Margaret's. Our responsibility was different. Our responsibility was to keep moving forward. And for the first time in many years, that's exactly what we were doing. The truth had cost us a great deal, but it had given us something far more valuable in return. Each other. If there's one lesson I learned through all of this, it's that love and silence are not the same thing. For years, I convinced myself that staying quiet was an act of love. I believed that protecting people from painful truths would keep my family together. I believed that patience alone could fix problems. I believed that if I sacrificed enough of myself, everyone else would eventually be happy. I was wrong. Real love is not protecting lies. Real love is not allowing harmful behavior to continue unchallenged. Real love requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Many of us, especially as parents and grandparents, are willing to endure almost anything for the people we love. We forgive, we excuse, we overlook, we give second chances. Sometimes that's a beautiful thing, but there must also be boundaries. Because when we tolerate manipulation, disrespect, or deception for too long, we don't preserve relationships, we slowly destroy them. Another lesson I learned is that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Forgiveness does not mean allowing someone to continue hurting you. Forgiveness simply means refusing to let bitterness control your future. You can forgive and still protect yourself. You can love someone and still tell the truth. You can care deeply and still set boundaries. Most importantly, never underestimate the power of truth. Truth can be painful. Truth can disrupt comfortable illusions. Truth can change relationships forever. But truth also creates freedom. Freedom to heal, freedom to grow, freedom to rebuild your life on something real. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever stayed silent to protect someone you loved? Do you think Wanda waited too long to tell the truth? What would you have done in her situation? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Thank you for spending this time with me.